Welcome, everybody, to this week's Griscom stream. Hope that you're doing well wherever you are at. I'm coming to y'all live from Austin, Texas. Feeling refreshed, but very ready to get back to it. Matt and I both had a pretty nice break. I've stayed healthy, which I'm very thankful for. I hope that you are happy and healthy wherever you are at. These are more casual streams than we do on Wednesday. Tomorrow we're going to be joined by Danny Bessner, friend and comrade. You should know him by now. He's doing incredible work on the foreign exchange Substack, as well as on American Prestige. You can also listen to his really great work with Matt Chrisman on the Hinge Points podcast. And on top of that, he is a professor at University of Washington as well. He's going to be coming to talk to us about a really great essay that he wrote on his Substack called The End of Mass Politics. And I should have put that out for a link to that for patrons, but you can find that on the Foreign Exchanges Substack. His most recent piece, I think, is really, really compelling. So we're going to have him on to talk about that. And we don't typically do this, but we're going to have a second guest too later, another TMBS crew, Gene Bajelon, who's going to come. Again, Gene is somebody you should know already, but if not, he is a professor at Missouri State, TMBS crew, and he's also one of the co-hosts of This Is Revolution podcast. So he's going to be helping us sort of break down what's going on in Turkey and all of the stuff that's going on there, because frankly, it's a part of the world that I have a passing understanding of, but I think is actually quite critical for not only understanding kind of regional politics across Eastern Europe and the Middle East, but also for this kind of growing international new right movement. So I'm really looking forward to having him on to talk about that as well. On top of that, I'm really excited. I haven't come up with a name for it. I hope that's okay. But Matt and I are going to start doing these kind of like segments. The working title I have for right now is like Take Hold of Our History, sort of playing off the Harvey K phrasing. But sort of looking at different moments in American, I'm happy to, expand the scope from just this country, but looking at kind of interesting moments, not just in like explicitly left socialist politics, but just sort of like workers' movements. And the first one we're going to be talking about is the fence cutting wars, which was something that happened right here in Texas. So I'm really looking forward to breaking that down. And as always, we'll have our post game. We'll be getting into a lot of fun. And this Sunday, I think Matt and I are going to be releasing a conversation we had on crypto land. So coming in strong again with our kind of our takes on crypto stuff. Well, yeah, y'all feel free to jump in with any questions. I'm going to keep on. I have everything up on the screen for me right now. This might be a little bit of I want to get into this Anton Yeager piece, and I want to talk a little bit about where I'm feeling coming into 2022. I think in this next year, we're going to probably want to start getting a few more. We don't want to do too much candidate stuff, but I think we might be trying to get a few people who are running really interesting progressive campaigns over the next couple of months, especially as, early primaries are coming up. But beyond that, I think, one thing that Matt and I really wanted to grow our coverage of in this next few months is going to be doing a little bit more on the ground labor reporting as we are sort of able to. So really looking forward to that. Oh, and last thing, sorry for the long introduction, but we're doing a new program on a site called Rockfin. It's not a new program. We're just going to be streaming there in addition to YouTube and Twitch and Facebook. It's a kind of like YouTube alternative. It's a monthly subscription. You get access to all the shows on it. So it's more like a Netflix than like a Patreon kind of thing. If you're already a patron of the show, you'll still be getting everything that you've currently been receiving. It just is a way for us to sort of reach new folks. And, YouTube can be a little bit funny when it comes to sort of demonetizing or suppressing videos of our show. We're very happy to be able to build out some resiliency. So if there's something that's interesting to you, check it out. But again, if you're already a patron, you're going to be receiving everything through Patreon as well. So this is, there's no need to switch up your subscriptions or anything like that. But if you're not already subscribed and you might have some issues or reasons that you don't want to pay for Patreon, check out Rockfin, where you'll be able to get access to the bonus shows and things like that through that as well. But well, let's see. I wanted to talk a bit about where we're at in 2022, and I think maybe going into this Anton Yeager piece might be a way to start that. But we got Comrade Strom McCollum, who says, thanks for a super chat too, brother. Says, proud cash reductionist here. Cryptocurrency isn't money. It's a use valueless commodity. Yeah, Matt and I are going to be talking about a lot more. I don't know if y'all have seen this crypto land stuff. It is almost like a kind of absurd parody of of the entire kind of crypto ideology, from just like really kind of cheesy and frankly uncomfortable crypto land is like this idea that they're going to go out and buy an island out in Vanuatu, and sort of create a paradise for people who are really into Web3, which is just a kind of very frightening cultural artifact to think about. But beyond that, it's got the kind of classic hubris, wherein, not only is the idea a little weird, it doesn't seem like the land that they're trying to purchase is really suitable for what their intentions are. Already a lot of kind of fraud. They've been stealing people's artwork and things like that. But we're going to break that down for a bonus episode on Sunday. I appreciate the super chat. And Comrade Mike, it's good to hear from you, friend. Says, Happy New Year, Comrade. I'm happy to be back. I've been, Matt and I did a little bit of a show last week, but, it was really nice to unplug, because I'll tell you, I love doing these streams, but it can take a lot out of you. And it was nice to get a little bit of time to get the patch back. So I've been really looking forward to sharing what we've been learning and thinking on over the past couple of weeks. Somebody says, Griscom, I was interested in talking to you about private and public money at some greater length than is possible here. Would it be okay to DM you on Twitter? Sure, you can send something to me on Twitter. You can also send an email to us at leftreckoning@gmail.com. I'm happy to hear from folks. Oh yeah, Jonathan says here too, hey David, I love the stream with Left Philosophy. Yeah, we were just on the show with Ben Burgess and the rest of the team at What's Left of Philosophy podcast, which is a phenomenal show if you haven't been following it. But on top of that, they also have a new YouTube channel. So let me put the link in there for y'all so y'all can go and give them a subscribe. They're really great folks. They're really great. They're really great folks. That podcast is incredible. They do kind of big breakdowns of different thinkers and movements. They had us on, Ben Burgess and I, on just a couple hours ago, actually, to talk about James Lindsay and Jordan Peterson and what this kind of reactionary movement represents. But I just put that in the chat if people want to check it out. But definitely, if nothing else, subscribe to their YouTube channel, because they're growing it and they are very good folks. All right. Yeah, and we've done a good amount on the crypto stuff, and we're going to do more this weekend. So I don't want to get too bogged down with all of that. But before we get to this, let me think. Before we get to this Anton Yeager piece, is there anything I wanted to play for y'all? I have like a list here, but Matt and I have a pretty jam-packed show, so I don't want to go through anything that we were saving. No, let's just do this Yeager piece, because I think it's a good place to sort of start this 2022 conversation, and I'll sort of just be reading the chat and hearing y'all's thoughts on this. If you're not familiar with Anton Yeager's work, you can read them in the Jacobin and Catalyst. This piece is in Tribune, which is Jacobin's paper now in the United Kingdom. But let's get this going. This Anton Yeager piece, I think, is really, really helpful, because the understanding where the left is at in 2022, we can only understand that as our political movements are coming out of like the Bernie Sanders era. Like, what are we left, post these kind of big Bernie Sanders presidential campaigns? What's left in the United Kingdom post, the Corbyn movement? What's left across a lot of other European parties? that sort of really rode this populist wave. I think that there's a little bit of a distinction to be made between what's been happening in the United States and a lot of European countries, and what we've been seeing from the left movements in, say, Bolivia or Peru, or even Brazil. But for this conversation, I think we're really going to focus primarily on the U.S. And the U.K. and a little bit broadly on on kind of like Western European, leftist, populist parties. But this argument by Anton Jaeger, I think, is actually very, very compelling, and sort of worth investigating. I'm going to pull it up right now for y'all, because I do think that we might be sort of entering into a new kind of era when it comes to, Lord, let me get it right. When it comes to left politics. The piece is in Tribune is called "How the World Went from Post-Politics to Hyper-Politics" by Anton Jaeger. And it starts here. In the years before the 2008 crash, technocrats ensured political debate was relegated to the sidelines. Today, politics is everywhere, but it hasn't returned in the way that many had hoped. And we're going to get a little bit closer to the text momentarily. But I mean, I think that just like from the outset, this is a kind of feeling that I think collectively a lot of people are experiencing. And I'm not even talking necessarily about people who are engaged in left-wing politics. But, it's a kind of common refrain when you talk to people, that everything's so politicized right now and there's so much tension in society. And I think in a lot of ways you can see why that's the case. I mean, we've seen massive popular uprisings, like, for example, Black Lives Matter. We're going through a massive pandemic that has shifted and changed the way that we live. Honestly, Trump really brought Trump and a lot of these kind of right-wing movements brought a lot of people's attention to politics. And, the kind of fights that we're having within the culture, within our kind of, national culture, social culture, whatever you want to call it, certainly are bubbling up into our social spaces, into our conversation with friends, family, and relatives. So in a certain way, you can feel like this is a very political era, right? This is a very political moment in our history, right? Everybody's engaged in following politics in some level. But then you start to look, especially now that we've seen what the Biden administration sort of represents and is, you start to have this question. It's like, well, if this is such a political moment, why does it feel like there isn't that much that is sort of changing for the better, especially for working people, but just in general? Why does it feel like the ball's not moving very much? On these questions. And I think Jaeger really makes some interesting points on this front. So let me bring this back up. Can y'all read it if I do it like this? I think that works. So let me go down here. So, the first bit of this piece, and again, you should read the whole piece. It's very, it's not too long. How the World Went from Post-Politics to Hyper-Politics in tribune.co.uk. But let's start, with this first bit, because I think that this is very interesting, and it sort of gets into a lot of the things that we talk about on the show. When I was doing the What's Left of Philosophy podcast earlier, I was talking about the fact that I feel like a lot of people have a mistaken view of what politics is. What does it mean to engage in politics? And that's why so much of our politics is sort of like internalized, right? You say, this is what my kind of personal political beliefs are. There's a lot of proclaiming it out, publicly, via social media. But there's a real big disconnect between the kind of personal perspectives that you hold as an individual and the kind of mass social movements that are necessary to enact political change, right? So we see this moment, right, where we have a few years of populism. Let me get this. We have the end of history, right? Y'all are probably familiar with that thesis, right? That sort of politics has entered into a period of time where the major social political questions have been settled. It's liberal global capitalism. That is the democratic capitalism. That is the one system, and it's just basically going to win out. This is the kind of triumphant thesis of the 90s, right after the fall of the Soviet Union. Communism has been defeated, and now it's just going to be a slow march towards the ultimate victory for the system of liberal democratic capitalism, right? And in that moment, you start to see this massive increase in what we could call like a technocratic government. Think Tony Blair, think Clinton. That was sort of depoliticized politics. Politics now went from being a site of kind of class struggle to a site of um, expert management. And you see it like that was an extremely, even though it's a very fascinating time, because even though we might sort of look back at it now, it's seeing, oh, this is a triumphant moment for neoliberalism. The gutting of social welfare programs, the destruction of trade unions, the destruction of so much social space. The way that it was sort of presented to people was almost as if this was, just kind of like scientific, um, prescriptions coming from, your doctor, right? All of these major political questions were sort of treated as if, they were treated as if they aren't political questions, right? They weren't engaged with and debated with on the level of like mass national politics. Rather, they were sort of things, all these different societies, some with leaders who were nominally right, some with leaders who were nominally left, implemented a similar kind of system of like neoliberal austerity, right? And this was just sort of taught and talked about as if it was just, this is just the way the world is. I believe Yeager makes the metaphor or something like that in this piece, that like, Tony Blair saying something along the effects of like, we're just catching the winds in our sail, right? Like this is just the way the world is going. This is not even like a kind of ideological choice. And we see right now, obviously, how that's one of the most ideological statements that you could make. But that really was this kind of moment of, 90s to early 2000s technocratic politics. You start to see a couple eruptions there that sort of challenge whether or not this kind of technocratic neoliberal system, if we have entered into the end of history, and that is the threat, brought on by like the neoconservative movement, by the idea that now like the, Bush and the axis of the willing, the coalition of the willing are going to, come and modernize these so-called, backwards, Islamo-fascist states, right? This is what the whole war on terror kind of discourse was about, right? But even when you saw that kind of break, it might have felt like something was radically different. When it came to, to the continuation of the neoliberal project, that sort of stayed untouched, right? So you have this technocratic moment, what they were sort of calling, sort of like the end of politics, the end of history. And then we see this like 2010 to the era that we're sort of entering into now, which Yeager calls and other people have called like the return of like populism, right? And this was a very different kind of politics, movement politics, party politics, in the sense of like being a member of a party, being organized in a party. That had sort of withered away. But people tried to reintroduce politics, reintroduce political questions into the public sphere. And right, in some ways it's Trump, but I think in the more compelling versions of it, it's this idea of what we could maybe call left populism, right? What we saw in Spain, in Greece, some levels with Corbyn, and some levels with Bernie Sanders, where all these people who sort of acted like politics was over and it's just sort of like elite managing of the system to sort of iron out the kinks. People started talking again about major systemic change to the to the system that we're under, right? Bernie Sanders was calling out systems like capitalism and private healthcare, and hyper inequality, right? All these kind of things. And there's some issues with that we'll get into, but like you see this technocratic moment, right? That goes all the way up until around like the 2008, 2010s. And then you see that post moment is like the era of this kind of movement, populism. And now we're entering into a new era. So I'm just making sure I'm not missing too much stuff in the chat as we keep on going, because I always like to hear y'all. Okay, so I think those comments are good, but I'm going to keep going on this piece because I think Yeager makes some really strong points here. So here we go. The rapid individualization and decline of collective institutions she diagnosed has not been halted. And he's using a novel here to sort of bring us through the text. I don't think that's super critical to break down, but he's sort of talking about this moment of rapid individualization and decline of collective institutions, right, which sort of was emblematic of this kind of technocratic moment, this kind of post-politics moment, certainly has not been halted. But barring a few exceptions, political parties have not regained their members, and that is the case today. Associations have not seen attendance rise, churches have not filled their pews, and unions have not grown precipitously. Across the world, civil society is still mired in a deep and protracted crisis. On the other hand, the mixture of diffidence and apathy that was characteristic of the 90s hardly applies today. Biden was elected on a record turnout. The Brexit referendum was the largest Democratic vote in Britain's history. The Black Lives Matter protests were mass spectacles. Many of the world's biggest corporations took up the mantle of racial justice, adapting their brands to support the cause. A new form of politics is now present on the football pitch, in the most popular Netflix shows, in the way people describe themselves on the social media pages. To many on the right, society now feels overtaken by a permanent Dreyfus affair. Cleveland family dinners, friends drinks, and workplace lunches. To many in the center, it has created a longing for an era before this hyperpolitics, a nostalgia for post-history in the 90s and 2000s when markets and technocrats were exclusively in charge of policy. An era of post-politics has clearly ended. Yet instead of a reemergence of the politics of the 20th century, complete with a revival of mass parties, unions, and workplace militancy, it is almost as if a step has been skipped. Those that were politicized by the era marked by the financial crash will remember when nothing, not even the austerity policies imposed in its wake, could be described as political. Today, everything is politics. And yet, despite people being intensely politicized in all of these dimensions, very few are involved in the kind of organized conflict of interests that we might once have described as politics in the classical 20th century sense, right? And I think this is a very serious charge, and finding ways to work through this are going to be really critical for building successful political movements. We're going to talk in depth with Danny Bessner, who has, it's not exactly the same, but wrote another piece about what he's calling the end of mass politics. But we'll get into that tomorrow. But this concept of hyperpolitics, I think, is very compelling, and it's quite the challenge for us to find a way to do something different from what we have been doing, and to sort of also learn the lessons from what happened with, for example, the Corbyn and the Bernie Sanders movement. I say this time and time again, but Bernie was always very clear about the fact that if me winning office is only like the beginning of this fight, and I think that's the correct analysis. But it was also fairly pessimistic in the sense that I think Bernie Sanders is 100% right. There's no way, and you can even see it with Biden right now. You see how much the state and his own party is sort of working, in conflict against him. And this is not because Biden is also not a willing participant in this kind of gridlock that is painting his presidency. But you just see how difficult that party functions when it comes to just kind of doing basic politics, nothing radical or anything like that. You see all the roadblocks in it. Could you imagine what it would be like if Bernie Sanders right now was trying to push through Medicare for all? Right? There'd be a lot of popular support for it, and we'd have to find ways to mobilize that popular support. But I hate to be pessimistic here. I don't think that we had built up the social structures, the political organizations, the social movements that would have been able to answer the call from those within the state had we won power, right? And the lesson I think that we need to learn from that is not that politics is impossible, not that that kind of movement is impossible, but that we should take the advantage of the moment right now where we're sort of disorganized, we're sort of out of power, to start building those social organizations that would be able to answer the call if, a kind of equivalent of a Bernie Sanders movement, were to arise in the near future. And the hyperpolitics of this, I think, is what makes this very difficult, because the point about hyperpolitics is not that people aren't really aware of political questions right now. It's that there is a disconnect between how much people are feeling um, about what's going on in the world, what's going on in society, might even be recognizing, for example, that the system is rigged. That we need to challenge authority, build up our own kind of movements. But a lot of people don't know how to do that. So what do most people do? They sort of retreat in and of them into themselves, and they feel that politics is about expression, right? It's like, so I'm going to go online and I'm going to say I finally found the truth. I'm like a democratic Leninist or something like that, and tweet it out, and people responding positively to that might make you feel like you're engaged in kind of real politics. Unfortunately, that isn't the case, right? And we've really built up, because the reason that's not the case, obviously, is because at the end of the day, like, you can get, kind of public support for whatever feelings that you're having or whatever political ideas that you have, but until you build up the institutions and the organizations that can put those into power, um, I don't know. It's like talking about, um, your dream home or something like that. So we need to be finding ways that we can build those political movements that can actually achieve not just power, but the ability to implement our kind of collective desires, and that comes through revitalizing working class movements. That comes from reclaiming the public sphere and public space that has been denied to us. I mean, neoliberalism, um, as an ideology, has been really effective. One, it's sort of imposing an austerity kind of budget on our system, and our communities, but also in its ability to sort of gut the social. So anything that wasn't sort of directly tied to the market, wasn't something that was directly tied to commerce. I mean, that started to wither away. Social organizations have withered away, and I can't tell you that that was an accident. I mean, I think that's a very big part of the neoliberal project. I mean, this is what Thatcher says when she says, we don't believe in society, right? There are individuals and their families, right? Neoliberalism was a turn, and a war on not just unions and like left organizations, but also any kind of social structures that might be able to build an alternative. Um, let's see. Um, so the question of hyperpolitics is actually really difficult, where people feel like everything is politics, that we're constantly sort of reminded of politics, that corporations are enacting politics for us. Oh, this horrible development company is doing land acknowledgments now, or like, Amazon is donating to this group or that group, right? You feel like there's a lot of kind of movement on these questions, but the fundamental social structures, the material structures, are left unchanged. And let's get back to the text a little bit, because I do think that the um, Anton Jaeger makes some really strong points about this moment. Um, Let me go down a little bit. And the bigger point is that some people are coming into politics, and as Jaeger points out here, um, despite people being intensely politicized in all these dimensions, very few are involved in the kind of organized conflict of interest that we might once have described as politics in the classical 20th century sense, right? And you haven't seen the kind of mass reentry into kind of political organizations or party membership, which that was how you were able to document a lot of these political struggles throughout the 20th century. Um, and this is not even just a left issue, or a symptom that is like unique to the left. And let me get okay. Here we go. Electoral opportunism is certainly part of the driving force behind this new movementism, right? And this is, talking about these movements that we've seen, these kind of populist movements, where you have a very strong, charismatic media head, right? This is Podemos. This is in a lot of ways Bernie. Um, you know, and obviously equivalents on the right wing as well. But you basically have these very charismatic media creatures, who publicly sort of ask people to do this or that, but there is um, no definite political structure, that is sort of able to organize the masses, right? So you have movements, but they're, and they're sort of directed in one way or the other, but they're not firmly disciplined. There is not a lot of structure within them. Um, and this is, a defining part of like the politics that we've seen over the past few years. Electoral opportunism is certainly part of the driving force behind this new movementism. For most European parties, the recent conversion to the movement model takes place against a double shift: a long-term decline in the number of party members and a continuous shrinkage in their electorate. Belgium offers a poignant example of this trend. The Flemish Christian Democrats still had an impressive 130,000 members in 1990. They now count a meager 43,000. In the same period, the Socialists plummeted from 90,000 to 10,000 members. The German SPD went from a million members in 1986 to just over 400,000 in 2019, while the Netherlands Social Democrats fell 103,000 to 41,000 in 2021. Almost everywhere, similar stories playing out. The former Mass Party lives on as a supplier of policy, but internally it is eaten up by PR specialists and functionaries. And Anton goes on to note that Britain was the kind of exception to this. I mean, Corbyn really did try to capture and retake the Labour Party, but you saw even with that movement that the later Labour Party structures were so um, opposed, just structurally, to mass movement democracy, that the second that the Corbyn project, had any setbacks, they were able to, to push back, and that was the whole, fight. Remember earlier in 2021 when they expelled, or they suspended Corbyn for a significant amount of time. Right, there has been a war within that party against its own membership. But let me get to this. These last bits, and then I can zoom out and read y'all's responses to this. He makes an interesting point about the kind of favorite model of politics these days being a kind of horizontalism, right? And a fear of any kind of like structural hierarchy within the organization. He makes the point that even though Black Lives Matter and QAnon morally and politically are completely foreign and not on the same moral level by any stretch of the imagination, the movements had some similarities in the sense that they don't have membership lists, and they have they have a lot of difficulty imposing discipline on their followers, and they do not formalize themselves into any kind of like actual political party, right? And you see this a lot with members of like Black Lives Matter, where somebody comes up and starts saying, well, I'm the spokesperson, or I represent this group, and they certainly don't. I mean, there's a lot of people who've been big time grifters around and within Black Lives Matter, but because it's not a proper political organization in the sense that has member lists and structure within itself, anybody can sort of come in and say that they are like the leader or represent a movement, and the truth of that statement is if whether or not other people are sort of following and responding to them, and that creates a lot of space for opportunists, right? And the point is like that's probably a political mistake to sort of organize on that level, but that it's making the point about that and kind of like right wing movements is to sort of note that this is just a symptom of the times that we're living in, these kind of hyper political times where everything feels really political, but the actual content of our politics is quite hollow, right? The organization of our politics is very, very limited. But let me read this last bit of this, and I can go back to the to reading all those questions um, and things. In many ways, we can describe this period as a transition from post to hyperpolitics, or the re-entry of politics into society. Yet our new hyperpolitics is also distinct in its specific focus on interpersonal and personal mores. Its incessant moralism and incapacity to think through collective dimensions to struggle. In this sense, hyperpolitics is what happens when post-politics ends, but not on terms familiar to us from the 20th century. The form political conflict takes is in the absence of mass politics. And this is the key point right here. The form that political conflict takes is in the absence of mass politics. Questions of what people own and control are increasingly replaced by questions of who or what people are, replacing the clash of classes with the collaging of identities. And this truly gets at some of the bankruptcy of this kind of new form of politics. Constantly is the conversation about whether or not somebody is, sincere, or can we find a way where they might be a hypocrite person, right? The question of politics, right, which is a social question, right, that should be reflective of social movements, um, and movements of classes and masses of people, instead starts to become very, very individualized. Is this person, morally good or bad, right? Is this person a true leftist or not a true leftist, to use the kind of fights that we see on our side, right? Again, I'll read that last line again. Questions of what people own and control are increasingly replaced by questions of who or what people are, replacing the clash of classes with the collaging of identities. And I think this is really the moment, that we're in. And I have some thoughts on things that we can start doing, but this certainly is the challenge of the moment that we are in. Again, I highly suggest people read the piece in its full, but this is certainly our, the struggle that we're in at this moment. I'm going to go up a little bit and make sure I'm not missing anything from the chat, but please feel free to respond in there, and I'll get to you in just a moment. Thank you very much, Kowalski. It's giving me the the image to text version of that super chat. I appreciate it, though. I hope you're doing well and had a good New Year's, Christmas. Um, okay. I am following y'all down to see what I can get to. I mean, I think they're talking about the movement politics. Often these movements are made up of people who don't feel pain from the system, but rather guilt. I don't know. I think that um, the, the kind of question of, like, the middle class and left politics, I think is worthwhile, to investigate, but more so on the question of why is so much of left politics being dominated by, a kind of, educated, not hyper educated, but educated, middle class, who are seeing, old opportunities drying up. I think that's a very valid question. With this kind of idea of, like, somebody's kind of like, is their story pure enough to be a proper socialist or a leftist, I think does actually get into this kind of same symptom of a fundamental problem of what we're calling hyper politics, right? Where everyone's sort of suspect until you can prove to me that, like, your personal story is beautiful and moving enough. Again, I don't think that it's wrong to sort of investigate these questions of class within left movements, but I do sort of caution against this over reliance on individual storytelling, because this is where we get into, a lot of problems of this hyper politics. But let me see. I'll read this right quick. And thank you so much, MIDI Doctors, from this. You've seen the calculations on how much crypto mining boosted Kazakhstan's electricity demand by up to 25% after large scale crypto moved there from China, who banned it. I did, and Matt and I are going to talk about that a little bit on Sunday, I think. Um, as for a take on it, I mean, it just sort of shows you the impracticality of that entire crypto system, that it is heavily reliant on, the cheapest possible, sources of electricity, which means that it's not impervious to movements and shakes that come from politics, and certainly not from the environment. I don't know. It sort of brings, to life the real world implications, and struggles that go into this kind of crypto fantasy that I think a lot of them ignore, as if it's sort of, I don't know, like I hate to use the term labor for crypto mining, but like the actual machinations that are necessary to uphold that entire system of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency in general, is very, very much rooted, actually, in kind of actual political and material restraints in the world around us. And it's, I think, it's for us, it's funny because you realize how little a lot of these people think about the actual, um, material question that goes into their kind of political economic worldview. Um, it was also very tragic, obviously, because it's a huge, huge waste. Um, So I'll read this, but I wouldn't agree that on this. It's like, when is our movement going to get real about the fact that China is CPC is one of the world's two great bulwarks of reaction? I would disagree with that characterization. I mean, um, the questions of movements within China and the role of the Chinese Communist Party, um, I think require a bit more nuance than, is this thing wholeheartedly good or bad. It's a very different system. It's certainly not the kind of social system that I'm trying to advocate for or build. Um, but this kind of like overly dramatic moralizing language about it, I don't find to be particularly helpful. Um, I don't know. I mean, I've done a decent amount on China, so I'm happy to respond to some things, but uh, I think that it's a mistake to think, for example, one like the American left is too soft on China. I think that that would be a huge overstatement, frankly. Um, so I'm not familiar with this piece, but I'll read it here. Matthew says, I found Yeager's piece resonated a lot with the ideas of Robert Putnam's in his Bowling Alone. So I'm not familiar with that, but I'll read that for people who know it. Specifically in the shift from cooperative behavior to expressive behavior and political participation. I mean, Yeager, I think, is very strong across the board. He wrote one of my favorite pieces once the lockdown started too, on I think one of the smarter left wing pieces there. And going back to our piece on Kazakhstan, many doctors followed up and said basically destabilize Kazakhstan. Yeah, it's very, very serious. Have you seen? And I'll tell you, Matt's a lot better on these things than me. But have you seen the use of NFTs in Roblox, an online platform that now makes more cash than Nintendo on virtual labor economy on 12-year-olds designing games? No, I haven't. Um, and we also got a message here from Nathan who says, check out Pete B's article in TechCrunch. Sad. I haven't seen that either. Um, so I haven't read the piece in The Nation. I've heard that Vijay Prashad felt that the way that he was quoted in that was not accurate, but I haven't read it yet, so I will be happy to and tell you all what I think after I do. Um, NFTs are not real. um, I can get behind that. Well, all right, y'all. I'm happy to maybe take a couple more, but if it seems like things are slowing down, we got a long show tomorrow. We're going to be talking with Danny Bessner about his piece. Let me bring it up right quick for y'all. Maybe give you all a quick preview of that. Honestly, I hate to be on the one track minded, but this question of mass politics is very much what I've been spending time over the weekend, over the break, catching up on. I've been reading some really exciting pieces and deeper histories into early American socialist movements. So we're going to be covering that a lot over the next few weeks. But I think that it really exposes some of the fundamental, I don't know, tensions that we're having right now with our politics, and it's helpful to look at other moments when it might have not seemed that mass political movements were possible. Um, Here we go. Let me just bring this up so y'all can read this maybe in advance before tomorrow. But this is Danny's piece in Foreign Exchanges, the end of mass politics. Ordinary people have almost no influence on politics. This is very similar to what we were talking about with Yeager. Despite clear majority support for ideas like public health care, universal child care, little headway has been made in getting these or similar programs enacted. We live in an era where the institutions of mass politics, mass-based political parties, the mass media, mass protests, and social media have proven themselves unable to serve as vehicles of the people's will. This, I believe, is a major, if underappreciated, reason why Americans feel so discontented from their government and their communities, and why so many of us are depressed. We are told and we trust that there are productive ways to channel our political desires, but in actuality, this is simply not true. And he goes through sort of the elite capture of a lot of the organizations and structures in our society. And these are his big challenges. And again, I highly suggest people read the entire piece. And we're going to go through it tomorrow too with Danny, but maybe a little food for thought. The rich can get richer and the poor can get poorer without there being a serious reaction. People are, as a whole, unwilling to put their lives on the line for politics. Congress largely has abandoned its role in war making. The voice provided by social media is largely an illusion when it comes to affecting those who wield real power, while the mass media is more interested in circuses than in informing. There is not a clear link between popular protest and political reform. Those who control the Democratic Party feel no compunction to listen to their supposed constituents. For the moment, at least, capitalism has won and its victory is totalizing. You don't need that many people to control and run the U.S. empire effectively. Um, and he says, I don't wish to imply that the above realities are eternal. Humans, as Marx said, make their own histories, even as if he added, we don't make them as we please. We live in a grim era where morbid symptoms abound. Our goal for the next decade must be to change that, and the only way to do so is to identify the present constellation of power in our society and strategize accordingly. If we do not, we will all continue to suffer. So we'll be talking about that tomorrow with Danny. Weird question, but I was looking to make stronger links between unions or union-like groups, um, like the local IATSE and music union AFM. Any cross pollination ideas? I mean, how do you mean? Like, are you a member of one of those groups and you want to, to kind of build more cross union solidarity? I think that that's very helpful. If that is the question, I think that's a good movement. I mean, I think the compartment. I mean, we're in a moment right now where we need to just like rebuild completely the membership in these unions, but the way that working class organizations have been sort of compartmentalized instead of being cross class is very unhelpful, I think, for in the long term for building socialist politics. And there is a reason that so many of American unions are sort of compartmentalized like that, and it was because there was a lot of worry that if you start getting people in cross class unions, that you might have a real problem with socialism on your hands. So I think it is very worthwhile for us to sort of break through that mold as much as you can. I think the move to internet and virtual spaces, in addition to the destruction of the public commons, has created coordination issues in social movements. I think that you're 100% right on that. And it also, virtual space also creates the kind of illusion of action too for people. But yeah, I don't think that there's any doubt about it that we've seen, people falling out of social organizations in general, let alone political organizations, and the kind of political moment that we're at. I think that's very much, um, uh, a big part of the kind of neoliberal victory here. Okay. Well, welcome our friends on Twitch too. I'm taking some questions before we roll out, but happy to hear from folks um, before we go. I would say to Strom here that I just don't find that you can make a very compelling argument to me that China is an imperialist power in the same sense as the United States. I think it's a growing power and a rising power that has a lot of more regional influence, but in terms of imperialism proper, um, I think we're a little ways out from that in the kind of Leninist understanding of imperialism. Um, you know, okay, I'm keeping up. All is hell. Callie Mark says, glad to see you, David. Hope all is hell. All is hell, friend. Let me see. Okay. I think that this might be it for now. Tomorrow, 7 Central, Matt and I are going to be hanging out with Danny Bessner and Gene Bajelon. We're going to be talking End of mass politics. We're going to be talking Turkey. I think we're also going to be talking insider trading within Congress. One of the more horrible stories, but one that should not be that surprising. It's going to be a lot of fun. We got a lot breaking down. We're also going to be talking about something that I've been getting really into, which has been the fence cutting wars. Give people a little preview. I mean, you see this mass removal of a lot of small farmers here in Texas, and in some parts of Oklahoma as well, along with this kind of migrating class that's coming over from the South, a post Civil War. And you see basically large Texan landowners, but also a lot of large European, particularly British interests, scooping up significant amounts of land after there is this massive depression in the late 19th century. And you see all of these kind of poor farmers who had owned their land, losing their land to the banks and then being sort of stuck into a tenant farming system. You also see people who, essentially cowboys, people who were raising cattle, fighting back against this massive enclosure of land. Sometimes legit in the sense that some guy bought the land and then they would put a fence around it, a barbed wire fence. But more often than not, big landowners filling in space that was supposedly publicly owned, right? Rivers or roads or things like that, and covering it with barbed wire. So you see this mass movement of people just going to those barbed wire fences and cutting them down, oftentimes arming themselves to protect them from the goons of these massive ranchers. And yeah, they fought back against this kind of massive enclosure system, and then a few people ended up joining and creating these kind of mass vigilante movements against fencing up of the land, right? And you see it in Texas, you see it in Oklahoma, and you also see it in New Mexico, all in different contexts and things like that. It was a really interesting moment because it ends up getting put down quite violently and ends up being a precursor in a lot of ways to the growth of the Texas Socialist Party, which was one of the largest and most radical actually in this country. So we're going to be talking about that a little bit tomorrow too. So I'm really looking forward to breaking that down as well. But I will see y'all tomorrow at 7 Central.